Hello, everybody. Welcome to another one. This time we're going to be looking at what happens after all that sort of chaotic period following the fall of the Han Dynasty. We're going to see that after about 300 years of that, things start to evolve, and there's another sort of attempt to create one unified sort of bloc politically across what we now call China. So we'll talk about imperial restoration and the creation of a sort of wider East Asian community. This is a little bit tricky because it often is depicted this way, right? Imperial restoration. But remember, there was no reason this had to happen. Just because there had been a big Han dynasty that had controlled a giant chunk of China doesn't mean that it needed to be that way. It happens to be that way. There was no sort of reason that all of China should be one thing or that there is one sort of China, right? But we'll look at what did happen, how a new power came and sort of beat up on their neighbors and was able to forge a unified large political chunk across what is today modern day China. And we'll see how that contributes to a sort of wider East Asian world. So in the late 16th century, or late 6th century, there is this sort of restoration, as it's often called, of imperial rule across China, leading to what a lot of scholars refer to as a sort of golden age or the sort of high age of Chinese culture. It's not always referred to that way now, right? Because people try to take a more sort of nuanced approach and all, but it's often considered this sort of like height of Chinese sort of cultural and artistic developments, and political expanse. So we'll see how that works. These new cultural forms, again, are going to be transmitted via Korea to Japan and straight to Japan from China as well. But it's going to sort of launch Japan on its own trajectory. Japan, like we saw before, is going to adopt a bunch of this stuff from China, but then they're going to veer off kind of on their own, and we'll get a sense of how that goes. So first we'll look at imperial restoration, the Sui and Tang dynasties. We'll try to determine if this leads to a new China. Is this more of the same? Is it a height of what was there before? Is it a new sort of synthesis? Is it just the best of what was? I don't know, we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about the further development of a sort of imperial rule in Japan and what they're getting from China, what they're doing with it, how they're sort of then going to evolve a little bit more on their own from that base that they're borrowing. So let's start with the development of imperial rule on a very, very large scale. Again, during the late 6th century, those northern kingdoms are going to start to consolidate. We already saw, for example, the Northern Wei at one time had a big sort of body of consolidated power in the north. But we're going to see something else develop that's going to lead to an attempt to unify all of these different kingdoms back towards the sort of perceived greatness of the Han. So remember, in Confucian ideology, there's this sense that the best stuff was in the past. And a lot of Chinese elites and scholars held on to that idea that the Han or the Zhou, these previous dynasties, had it right, had the good stuff, and it's about getting back to that. So we're going to see the sort of foundation of the Sui is built on that. The Tang is a little bit different. We'll get to them too. So here you go. Here's a look at that sort of northern consolidation. So after the fall of the Han, we've looked at the 16 dynasties period and the different dynasties in the south and the former Zhou and all these sorts of things. But here we're going to see something a little bit different. You can see these different sort of empires in miniature, if you will, that had formed out by this period by about the middle of the 500s. And were sort of temporary consolidations of power, right? So remember, these are all shifting all the time. So in 581, there's a coup in one of these northern provinces or sort of kingdoms or mini empires, if you will, that puts a guy named Yang Jin on the throne. There you go. Here, I'll go back for a second. I can't go back. Okay, don't worry about it. That puts him on the throne, and he is going to proclaim himself an emperor, like we saw a lot of these sort of independent kingdoms or sort of expansive sectional empires were doing. So he takes an imperial name, right? He's in the Sui family, right? It's going to be the Sui Dynasty, and the name he takes is Wendy. So cultured emperor, Sui Wendy. Now we've kind of heard some of these before, right? Remember, the emperors are using names from the past in the same way that we see this in Rome, right, where the Roman emperors sort of adopt titles from previous emperors and stuff like that. So we've seen Wendy before, but here's Sui Wendy. He's a cultured emperor. But was he all about culture and stuff? I'm not so sure. We'll kind of get to some of that. He certainly raises a tyrant. So he's going to have this vision of taking China back to where it was during the Han. He wants to take this northern Zhou state and expand it over all the former territories of the Han, stop this sort of what in his mind is chaotic division between the different Chinese states, and sort of reconstitute one large empire. And lo and behold, he's going to manage to do it. It starts by conquering the south. He captures the capital at Nanjing. Remember, Nanjing just means southern capital. We're going to see it a lot. It remains a capital city, just like Beijing, right, coming forward. Anyway, when he captures the city of Nanjing, which is currently, at the time, a capital for one of the southern kingdoms, it's completely destroyed. So yeah, he's cultured and all, but he also completely savages one of the other kingdoms in order to make a point about his consolidation. Once he destroys the sort of southern kingdoms, he comes out with a new proclamation that as Sui Wendy, as the emperor of this new Sui dynasty, he is in control or in charge of everything under heaven. So again, you have a sort of escalation, right? We've seen that mandate of heaven where a ruler says that they're in charge at the behest of universal powers. Here, Sui Wendy is going to say he has the mandate of heaven, the new Sui dynasty has the mandate of heaven, but not only that, it doesn't just extend to whatever they control, it extends to every possible angle of control. Even though he doesn't necessarily have military control, you know, far out or in the hinterlands yet or anything like that, he's saying that morally, intellectually, you know, by providence, it's already done, right? He already controls the universe essentially, or everything underneath the cosmic power, right, is under the Sui dynasty. But in order to consolidate that power, in order to actually get it, you might have to give up an awful lot. So if you want to be a nice cultured emperor, but you also want to expand over a bunch of other people that have their own militaries, their own empires, their own emperors, right? You might have to engage in a lot of practices you don't necessarily want to. The Sui dynasty is going to expand really quickly through military force in particular, but also through a number of alliances with locals and stuff like that. So I can play you this video really quick. It's like a weird, there's music and stuff to it, don't worry about that. It's a great map that shows how the empire expanded really quickly and then how it fell apart. So the Sui dynasty is only going to have two emperors, Sui Wendy, right, who's the founder, and then his son, Sui Yang. So Yang we're going to see as maybe not a great emperor, but he is the next sort of ruler. So we'll play this video, check out this map that's here to the side, and you'll see how quickly this empire sort of expands, and then how quickly it falls apart. So it's going to play kind of by year on the side, the expansion and contraction. So you kind of saw it starts in the sort of traditional northern section of China. It's going to expand down right from that Zhou and conquer the southern kingdoms. Then, under the second king or the second emperor, it's going to expand into what today is northern Vietnam, parts of Korea. It's going to expand way out west, right? So a very big, expansive empire. But then, really quickly, you also started to see like holes developing in the main sort of body of the empire itself. Those holes get bigger and bigger, and then it's gone, right? So this is a classic example of sort of imperial overreach, much like we saw with the Qin, right, originally. So the Sui dynasty puts together all of these different kingdoms and empires really quickly, whether they're tired of war or through alliance or through military victory, but holding on to it is really tricky. Um, Once they develop this big empire, they build a new capital, right? That's what you want to do. You want to have a center for your empire. In this case, it's Chang'an, which you might have already seen or remember, right? This is like one terminus of the Silk Road, basically, the sort of link into China. So if you were going to trade a lot of things along the Silk Road or something, typically you would either start or end here in terms of where the money flows. Also under the Sui, both Sui Wendy and his son have the idea that in order to build a big cohesive empire, you need to engage in public works. You have a big empire, what are you going to do with it? We're going to make it great. How are we going to make it great? Let's do big things. Let's try to rebuild or finish building that Great Wall. It wasn't really a thing yet, right? Those were all sections of different walls. Let's build a big canal that stretches from the Yangtze to the Yellow River, right? Let's build huge military forces, all these sorts of things. But a lot of this was forced. So here you go. Here's the Sui Dynasty in about 609, right? When it's actually established at its sort of height. You can see it stretching way out into the desert. Remember, again, that's to Western China. That's that Silk Road sort of line, right? So these ruthless military campaigns to expand the empire, most of them are going to be under the second empire, the second emperor in the dynasty, Emperor Yang. So this is Sui Wendy's son. He is thought to have maybe had his father assassinated so that he could take the throne. He's not a lovely guy. He is considered one of the, sort of great tyrants of Chinese history. I'm sure he'd do very well on Survivor, all that sort of stuff. His continuation of the expansion of the state was sort of mind-boggling. He knew that there were peoples and resources in Southeast Asia and up further towards Korea, and he wanted them. He wanted to expand his control, right? Remember that idea of everything under heaven belonging to the Sui. So he's going to try to do that. But that's ultimately going to lead right to the end of the empire itself. So here are sort of under Emperor Yang, the sort of advances he tried to make. You can see in the south there around Vietnam, his forces are going to go pretty far into what today is like central Vietnam. Also, he's going to try and go north and east over there towards Korea, right? We can see that sort of little peninsula sticking out. Yeah, there's the Korean peninsula, but like I meant like the sort of little arm of the Chinese state kind of extending that way. Also, here you can get a sense of where Chang'an is. It's the city right in the center there, right along that little bend, back bend in the Yellow River there. And it's still a very famous city in China to visit today. It's sort of right at the very edge of the Silk Road, right, coming out of those western desert areas. So why did Yang have a bad time? What's he going to do? What's going to happen to Yang? Well, in order to try to extend into Vietnam and Korea, he had to raise giant militaries. In particular, his giant military he sent to Korea just did not work. The Koreans had been working on heavy cavalry and other things like this. They're not quite there yet, but the Chinese forces that went up there just did not do very well. In fact, they did really poorly. It's going to lead so poorly, in fact, that it probably is a big determinant in Sui's end. There'll be other stuff as well. So here he is again, Emperor Yangdi, or just Yang, right, is fine. He was making lots and lots of enemies. Sending soldiers up to Korea, as it turns out, was a really bad idea. He sent, if the numbers are to be believed, millions of people, tons of soldiers, tons of support from northern China to go attack the kingdom that was there. At this point, Korea is not one thing, it's like 3 different kingdoms. You can see some of that in the book if you want, but don't worry too much about it. So the Chinese forces go up there and they just get decimated. As many, maybe as 1 million soldiers are lost. This is the biggest pre-modern army, in the world. Is amazing size, this huge military campaign. Well, where did you get all these people to go up to Korea? These were conscript soldiers. These were press gang soldiers, maybe criminals, people that couldn't pay their taxes, people that were forced into the military. So not a professional military service necessarily. And when you do something like this, people no longer want to be part of the military. People don't want to be in service of the state. When you see that the young men that get taken from your village are all shipped out to the middle of nowhere and die, maybe due to like bad planning, you don't want your young men from the village to go do that. So this is sort of turning on Yang. He's seen as a tyrant. He's seen as expecting too much from the villagers. Now remember, according to the mandate of heaven, if the king or the emperor is doing well, everything else will do well. When you start to have problems, either in nature or politically, it can signal that maybe the empire has lost the mandate of heaven. So maybe a little bit of that idea is floating around amongst some elites and generals and things like this. Also, this is really expensive. Fielding an army with 1 million people, 1 million soldiers, requires a couple million support crew, right? Lots of animals, wagons, food, all this sort of stuff. How much food does 1 million people eat, a night, right? Stuff like that. So this is costing a ton of money. And in order to get that money, the Sui Dynasty is going to tax the population more and more. So even though under the Sui Dynasty, we're going to see the economy was pretty good, and commerce is working quite well. The relative peace within the dynasty at points is helpful for commerce and the economy. But if the dynasty is going bankrupt, they're going to tax their citizens more to raise that revenue to engage in these massive projects. We're going to see these state projects, and to engage in war. But as you know, people don't like to pay too much taxes, especially if your taxes are being utilized in ways that you don't like. So a lot of peasants, a lot of the Chinese, particularly in the north, feel overburdened with taxation, and this is going to lead to a lot of peasant rebellions. A lot of villages refuse to pay taxes. They refuse to have their young men submitted to military service, and this leads towards sort of insurrections. At the same time, there's another problem. There's this large confederation of Turkic peoples that had formed north of China. Again, we've sort of seen this before, right? These sort of outside people on the border with China. And Sui Wendi had dealt with this politically. He'd made alliances, he'd sort of bought them off. But Emperor Yang, right, was a tyrant, and he wasn't going to make alliances with these silly horse people or pay them or, marry into these families, stuff like this, right? So he came into conflict with these sort of Turkic peoples and had direct military sort of engagements with them. So even as he's losing in Korea and there's peasant rebellions and he's taxing people harder, there's also a war kind of brewing with these Turkish people up north. So Young did what you're sort of expected to do. He went up towards the front lines to sort of engage with these people. It's sort of a military tactic, sort of a political tactic. But what he didn't expect was the Turkish folks were not dumb, and they knew what was happening, and they may have had help from other locals and people that were upset with Yang anyway. They trap him. So in 615, Emperor Yongdi rides north to go sort of appraise the military and political situation, right? As a leader, you have to occasionally go into the field. And when he's there, Turkic armies had been laying in wait. They surround his camp, and basically it looks like it's all over for the Sui Dynasty. Yang is stuck. But as it turns out, his family is going to come to his rescue. There's a sort of subsidiary branch of the family, the Duke of Tang. These are sort of like extended cousins, the sort of Tang branch. So there's two sort of cousins that are going to rescue him. The older one is Li Yuan, who is he is the Duke of Tang. He's the sort of head of this district. And Li Shimin, who is the sort of warrior. So the warrior is going to get sent to ride out to save Yangdi, and he does. But when he does this, he returns to Li Yuan and says, look, it's all over for the Sui Dynasty. These people have lost the mandate of heaven. They were trapped by these barbarians. We saved them, but basically the empire is falling apart. We should step up and we should lead a new dynasty, basically to protect China. It's our duty to keep the empire intact. Li Yuan is nervous about this. He takes some time, but he's going to decide he kind of wants to do it. Everybody agrees that Emperor Yang is bad. He flees into exile. He goes into the south somewhere to basically hide. A regent is put on the throne in his place, as the sort of Tang family, the Li Yuan, makes moves to sort of start deposing him. There he is. There's Li Yuan. Well, it sort of foments into a rebellion, and in 617, Li Yuan openly rebels against the emperor. His family is going to occupy that capital at Chang'an, which doesn't really matter because Emperor Yang has already fled anyway, right? He's hiding in the south. So the capital is kind of open. And when he invades the capital, he plays it cool, like he's helping the empire stay together. He takes Yuan's grandson, right, and puts him on the throne and says, because they're in the same family line, right? So he's like, okay, we're continuing the family line. He's going to be the emperor, but I'm going to serve as the regent for a while until he's old enough to know what he's doing. So Li Yuan becomes the sort of new emperor by default. He's the regent who's in charge of this little boy emperor. Then Emperor Yang is hiding in the south. He's considered a retired emperor because there's a new emperor on the throne. And when he's hiding in the south, mysteriously, he's murdered. It was somehow by the members of his own court. So his own sort of bureaucrats, his own officiants, maybe his eunuchs, it's unclear, decide to murder him. So he gets strangled while nobody's looking. When that news gets back to the capital, the sort of fake emperor thing that's going on is over. Li Yuan says, look, Emperor Yang is dead. We don't have to pretend we're kind of continuing the same line anymore. We're just going to do our own thing. The Li family, saved the emperor before. We've been running the capital for a little bit. We're just going to go on ahead and proclaim a new dynasty. So they take the Duke of Tang, right? That's where they get this name. They're going to extend that. They're going to be the Tang Dynasty. Li Yuan gives himself a new name, Tang Gaosi. So there he is as the emperor. He's no longer the Duke of Tang. Now he is an emperor. So the Tang Dynasty is generally considered to be the most impressive, most incredibly expansive, best time to be alive in China, the sort of golden age. It starts under the Sui in a sense, but this is like considered to be the height of Chinese culture and what everybody thinks of when they think of this like Chinese past and the sort of where all the sort of romance movies are set and where the best stuff is built and all these sorts of things. So the Tang Dynasty is around for a long time. It's founded in 618 and it's around until 907. So a pretty long period. And this is something different than we see happening in Europe, right? So we saw the Roman Empire. It's always good to just kind of compare because the comparison between Rome and Han is often made. So Rome and Han both kind of fall apart, but then there's not going to really be another European empire. We know that there is like the Holy Roman Empire, and I'm sure you've heard that it's not really an empire and it's never, a thing. But the Tang do sort of reconstitute this giant unified state over central China, and then they continue to expand to northern Vietnam, sections of Korea. Way out west on this map, you can see the sort of highest height of the Tang. I mean, they're wrapping all the way around the Tibetan Plateau, down into areas that we now think of as maybe even like northeast Afghanistan. It's really crazy, sort of far out there. Now, did they really control all that area? Nah, it's sort of too far away and all, but it's considered their sorts of territories. Also, you can see that those people layered like the Eastern Gokturks and stuff like that. Those are vassal states to an extent. They're also sort of in conflict with them to an extent. Anyway, it's a huge state. There is going to be a brief intermission near the end of the 600s pretty quickly in the dynasty from Empress Wu, who is going to try to take over and form a new Zhou dynasty. It doesn't really work out. The book does some good stuff on that, but then it's going to go back. She's sort of the last female empress in a sense. There's going to be other powerful women that rule as regents, but not necessarily as an empress. And we'll see something very similar when we talk about Japan in a minute that happens kind of around the same era. So this incredibly expansive state, it's very cosmopolitan, right? You have this massive empire. You're talking about hundreds of different ethnicities, races, languages, just different worlds coming together. And if you were to cut into world history, say at like 800 CE, and just say, well, what's the best place to live? What's the most developed state? Who has the most rights, the most money? Where's the coolest place to be? It would definitely be Tang China. In a sense, they're sort of the center of the world. And that fits with the Chinese way of thinking at this time. So remember, the mandate of heaven was kind of twisted a little bit by Sui, like if the cosmos gives the emperor rule, then the emperor claimed that everything under heaven, right, was ruled by him, sort of putting China at the middle of the world. So in Chinese, they don't use the word China, right, for the state. The word is Zhanghua. And the character for this is literally just like the center land or the center state or the central country. It's sort of everything that's there is in the center. That's China. And then everything else around it is not, right? So it's a very sort of I mean, you would say it was egocentric if it was a person, but it's not egocentric, right? Because it's a state. But despite that, it remains extremely cosmopolitan, at least at first. And that's part of what leads to this sort of idea of a golden age in China. So here's another depiction of the Tang, the way it sort of eventually settles out. And you can see these huge expanses into the Western Desert area. So a couple people had asked about Tibet, and Tibet is usually included more with South Asian history. You can make the argument that culturally, linguistically, stuff like that, it's more connected to India and that region of the world than it is to China, at least early on. The Tibetans had their own kingdoms, and there was their own culture, their own writing systems that are very different from Chinese. They're not Chinese people at all. They had trade relationships with China, and we're going to see later they actually developed more extensive connections with the Mongols and people in Central Asia and in the north. There will be a connection between Tibet and China in the sort of pre-modern world. We'll get to that later. It starts religiously rather than sort of culturally or politically or economically, and then extends. And so we'll get to that a little bit. That will be important sort of later on. Okay, so here is a depiction of emissaries coming to China. So there's the emperor getting fawned on, fanned, people celebrating him essentially, his servants. And then these three people are emissaries from the empire, from the far reaches, or even from other sort of states, right, that would engage in this system of, well, it's often referred to as a tributary system. We're going to see there's a lot of problems with that. We won't talk about the tributary system here too much. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Other states do send political and diplomatic and economic sort of emissaries and ambassadors to China. In a sense, the states around China know it's the biggest state as well. So you want to engage with them. You want their trade, you want their protection, all that sort of stuff. So the tributary system, in a sense, is these outsider states or even regions within the empire that want a direct connection with the Chinese state. So that's what you see happening here. We'll talk more about it. It's often sort of overly simplified to mean that there were like other states that like paid their allegiances to China or something like that. That's not quite it. We'll get to more of that though in the future. So along with the Sui and Tang comes a massive sort of set of cultural changes. Just like you might expect, when you go from an era where there's sort of constant shifting of the states and constant shifting of who's in power, the borders, where people are, to a more settled, sort of clearly defined definition of who's in power or what the state looks like, that leads to more prosperity in a way. So what is it that we're talking about? What is this prosperity? What does it look like? What do we mean when we say this is a sort of golden age for China? Let's try and figure that out. One of the first things you see is a massive revival of the sort of Confucian tradition. So we talked about after the fall of the Han, you get this sort of pull back in a sense from Confucianism, a lot of people questioning its value. Then many of you read about the identity crisis in southern China, right? When you have all these different states competing for who's going to be Chinese. And in the South, they had developed an idea that what really bonded together elite Chinese culture, no matter what language you spoke or where you were from or whatever, was the Confucian rituals and practices. And that these ideas presented by Confucius, but also the whole sort of system of scholarly knowledge afterwards that was derived from it, were the basis for correct sort of Chineseness, not only in a sort of philosophical sense, but also in an ethnic sense. If you knew the Chinese classics, if you were steeped in Confucianism, you were also Chinese. So it's kind of complex. It's different than our ideas about race or ethnicity. So with the revival of Imperial Dynasty and the Sui and the Tang, you see again a doubling down of Confucianism and this sort of Chinese style of government that comes along with it. So in 587, you get the first standardized Confucian exams that are issued government-wide, meaning if you want to be an elite, if you want to be a member of the aristocracy, if you want to be a judge, or if you want to be a governor, if you want to be high up in society, the way you do that is by studying the Confucian classics, and then each year there are these big exams that are issued in all the Confucian temples and schools around in the sort of provincial seats. You go to one of these places, you take the exam. Depending on which exam you take and how well you do, you're awarded a degree. There's two different types, the Mingjin and the Jinshi. So the Jinshi is the highest degree, you're like a master. The Mingjing is a lower degree, and it qualifies you for lots of different government service, but it doesn't put you in the sort of top spots. For the Jinshi degree, there's a huge failure rate. Out of hundreds of tests, you might only get a few that actually pass and get this degree. You have to have sort of expert knowledge of the classics. You have to be able to rewrite whole sections and paragraphs. Sometimes you're given things like a random sentence from a Confucian classic with a couple words missing, and you have to fill the words in, things like that. So you're tested over your knowledge of the classics, your ability to read and understand poetry in the sort of classical tradition, and your knowledge of classical literature. At the same time, if you're going to be tested over those things, there has to be a standardized body of material. So you can think of this like an SAT, right? If you're going to be tested on the SATs, there has to be some sort of idea about what's in them, right? So you can buy like a study guide, you have classes that prep for this, right? And then everybody kind of takes the same test. So it's the same thing. Everybody knows what's coming on these tests, basically. You know the format. You just have to cram a bunch of knowledge in there. And essentially, it's not about creativity at all. Remember, Confucianism is a conservative ideology. You're not supposed to necessarily invent anything new. You're supposed to be able to perfectly reiterate the awesome stuff from the past. In a sense, this creates a meritocracy, at least in some levels, of this new Chinese state, both in this way, but then especially in the Tang. So what that means, what a meritocracy is people in positions of power don't get there because of family or money or things like that. They get there because of merit, right? So success and social standing is based on merit. There's a problem with this, though. Like all meritocracies, it is based on class. If you're poor, you can't necessarily send your kids to school. So they're not going to learn to read and write. They're not going to learn the classics. They're not going to be able to pass the tests and succeed. If you happen to be very wealthy and your children don't have to work 12 hours a day on the farm, they can learn to read, right? They can study, they can engage in these sorts of things. They can travel to the testing locations, all that sort of stuff. So it does produce a meritocracy in terms of, at least amongst the elite classes and the wealthy classes, you still have to be knowledgeable and prove that you can succeed in this sort of educational environment, or you don't get a job. So in particular under the Tang, this gets just absolutely solidified, this Confucian ideology. Remember, Confucianism is really good for the ruling class because it promotes a whole sort of ideology of loyalty towards the center, towards the emperor, things like that. During the Tang, there's a huge expansion of Confucian schools. Every big city, every big town, every provincial seat is going to have Confucian temples and schools. Lots of emperors are going to order that, temples and schools be built in their name. By 738, there's thousands of these things, right? 19,000 official schools or so around the country, around China. And then about 1,000 private schools in the main sort of area, and then thousands of private schools scattered on the fringe. If you were too far from Chang'an, too far from the capital, you might not necessarily have the best education. You might not necessarily have access to the best scholars. That's why these private schools pop up, right? Private masters, instructors that sell their ability to get your kid to pass these exams, basically, right? So this is sort of cropping up all over the place. Here's a sort of Confucian scholar in action, right? Holding his, this is like a little book, essentially, right? It's like I guess the version we would have like a little notepad, right? He's holding like the Chinese equivalent at the time of like a little notepad, right? Performing his rites. Here's a Confucian temple, right? So by 630, right? So really early on in the Tang. These are everywhere. You can still go to these in China today. These are places where you can go and perform the proper Confucian rites. You can engage in, you can sort of speak to your ancestors, right? You can do all kinds of stuff. This is often also where fortune tellers and other people hang out around these sorts of places. So they become sort of central hubs in Chinese society and life, much more integrated, not just at the educational level, but also in a sort of spiritual sense, even though Confucianism doesn't deal a lot with spirituality yet. Some people in the discussion had asked about a sort of synthesis of Buddhism and Confucianism. We're going to get to that, but that's going to be a little bit later. So at the same time that we see Confucianism totally on the rise, Buddhism is also very much on the rise across China, across the new Sui Empire and the Tang Empire. It was getting more and more popular and becoming a sort of indigenous religion almost, in a sense. So I put the domestication of Buddhism. What that means is, by this point, people in the region, people in East Asia, don't see Buddhism as foreign, even though, people who studied the texts and scholars, Buddhist practitioners, monks, would know of the sort of Indic origins for Buddhism. It was still seen as a Chinese thing. It wasn't seen as like a foreign import. You might compare this to Christianity in the United States. Most American Christians probably are not thinking, regularly anyway, about Christianity being from the Middle East. If they think of it at all, they think of it as a European religion, which is interesting because, it wasn't even European per se, right? It was Middle Eastern originally, from the Jewish tradition there, etc. So Buddhism has this sort of origin in India. It goes through Central Asia, it comes to China, and at first, during the Han, it's seen as this sort of foreign religion that's interesting. After several hundred years, though, it's indigenous. It's baked into the Chinese philosophy and way of doing things. And the Sui and Tang emperors are going to be huge for it. Not only is it useful to them in that the population themselves is becoming more Buddhist, and so you want to attach yourself to that, it's seen as something that the rulers can do, maybe to maintain the mandate of heaven, maybe to make the population less hostile towards them, to encourage good practices. It's tied to commercialism through the Silk Roads, all kinds of stuff like this, right? So it's imbued with a certain religious power that the emperors want to tap into. So many of the Tang emperors begin to, in fact, in the new capital, have sections of the palace reserved for monks to come and read the sutras and pray and meditate and sort of officially, in the name of the emperor or the imperial palace, align the universe or make the best outcomes for the dynasty. 5 of the emperors during the Tang period actually order that temples be built in all the provinces across the new dynasty, the new empire. So Buddhism is becoming quite widespread. So if you see this image here, it's very Chinese, even though it still has these Indian elements left. It still has Central Asian elements left. From a sort of art history perspective, it's kind of changed, right, every time. And so you're getting more of what the sort of Chinese depictions of the Buddha are. So you start to see things like this that, although it still has, you can clearly see that sort of South Asian roots, right, like the deities with multiple arms. It's becoming something else. It's not going to be South Asian anymore. By the time you get to stuff like this, the Buddha is clearly Chinese. It's a different style. This is from that Northern Wei, right, dynasty coming through. So they're already sort of reinterpreting and creating a whole aesthetic or a whole sort of culture around the religion or around the sort of philosophical practices of Buddhism that are tied into Chinese-ness, that they're promoting. This goes so far as to have these huge productions. So, for example, these are absolutely giant Buddha statues that are carved into the side of a cave under state sponsorship during the Sui and the Tang. There are whole sort of temple complexes and giant sections of riverbanks or of caves that are essentially transformed into huge indoor-outdoor temple kind of things. So you can't get a great scale of this. This is one of the biggest Buddhist statues, right, in the world. Here I am across the river from it, right, so you can get a sense of the scale of the size of that statue by comparison. You also start to get these sorts of things in the south. Here's another giant Buddha statue, this one sitting in a different posture, right, carved into the cliffside along the river. So you can see those people there along the bottom, right? That gives you another sort of sense of the scale of the size. This takes an incredible amount of work, right? Part of the reason you build these things is in itself it shows the dedication to the religion. It also shows the sort of majesty or grandeur of the religion, right? That contributes to its spread, as lots of holy works do, and these sorts of things. They become pilgrimage sites, right? All that sort of stuff. Here's one of the sutras. So remember we talked about earlier, as Buddhism comes into China, there's actually tons of new sutras that are made, including what are now some of the most famous Buddhist sutras, were just constructed in China. So through revelation, through reasoning, about a third of all the sort of Buddhist literature that exists in China originated in China, meaning it's not part of the original transmission, meaning it doesn't have a South Asian origin, it's Chinese. And the sutras were incredibly popular, right? These are sayings, these are religious principles. Sort of you might equate them to books in the Bible, something like this. They were often read out loud. Even though in East Asia there was a really high literacy rate comparatively to the rest of the world, the sutras were often read out loud as a sort of devotional practice, right? The emperors had it done in their imperial palaces and things like this. And the use of the sutras was so widespread that they actually outnumbered the Confucian classics, right, in circulation. In any market, in any city, you could find the sutras and these sorts of things for sure. They were often kept in really cool containers like this. This is kind of like a scroll case, right, for these sutras. So you can see just even on the outside the sort of work that goes into creating these products. On this one, actually, really interestingly, you can see sort of the Chinese style lion underneath the Buddha, but having the lion on there, right, would have been a South Asian theme. So they're still kind of mixing and mingling between the sort of aesthetics, even as Buddhism is becoming an indigenous sort of Chinese product. Also, you begin to get a new architectural style around Buddhist monasteries. So here's a large Buddhist monastery, a Buddhist temple, where you have monks living on the grounds, maintaining the grounds, much like a Christian monastery or something like that you might be more familiar with. And these are really large complexes. In the case of Japan, there's like a whole side of a hill in the capital that's just Buddhist temples. In China, there's large sections of cities that are Buddhist temples or sort of retreats that are right outside of the city. Sometimes these were integrated into everyday life. Sometimes these were for people to take a break from society and sort of unintegrate from the world, if you will, and go on these sort of retreats to be alone and to be isolated. So there's a lot of stuff going on. During this process, Buddhism is changed. Remember, we already talked about Hinayana and Mahayana from that perspective, or Theravada, right, is the sort of more neutral term. The Mahayana Buddhism that's developing in China is becoming less about escaping the world. That idea of karma and breaking reincarnation and stuff like that is very Indian, it's very South Asian, and that didn't really work in China. The version of Buddhism that's becoming more popular, or the main idea, is not to sort of escape reality, but to sort of awaken to the reality around you and to become spiritually and mentally powerful within the world that really does exist, to see things as they really are, which, although not a tremendously huge difference, is an important distinction because it sort of speaks to the way Buddhism is being reinterpreted and appropriated to Chinese culture, and vice versa. At the same time that you see this rise in sort of new philosophies and religions, or a sort of reinvigoration of them, there's a lot of stuff going on that's more traditional when we think of a society developing or being innovative or really creative. We already mentioned the Grand Canal with the Sui. These were these sort of big work projects, right? So one of the goals of the Sui was to unite the country, this new country, this new dynasty that had formed. And you don't just do that politically or economically, you can do it physically. In this case, the idea was to dig a canal that would connect the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, as well as major sort of trading ports. So you can see this red area on the map. These are canals that were dug. Remember, there's no heavy machinery yet or anything like that, so this is quite a long period of time. This is thousands of miles dug along the rivers, in between the rivers, and to these major ports, right? So Hangzhou is a major port on the coast. So these rivers connect. Now, if you grow rice in the south, you can move it through the canals to the north. You can move soldiers through the canals. It's great for commerce. These are still around. So the canal is still there. We're going to see it falls into sort of disrepair for a while, and then it gets fixed up. And now they're still around for local commerce and movements. Some of the areas along the canal are really beautiful and are quite famous as like tourist attractions, but you can get a sense of how big it was. I mean, imagine if there was just an artificial waterway created all the way up and down, like California, for example, for boats to be able to move. It's a really long distance, and all along the canal, cities would pop up that would sort of service these trade routes, right? So you get these market towns and other things along the canal, even as the canal is connecting market towns. So you get a sort of big economic benefit out of it. Things can move much quicker. At the same time, the capital city, Chang'an, is becoming just the world's greatest city. And we've seen this already, right? The majority of human history, China has been a huge population center and has had the biggest cities. Chang'an is no exception. During the Sui and Tang Dynasty, it's the capital, and it comes to be just this amazing city. Because it was a new capital, you can sort of start from the ground up in some ways. If you look at this depiction of it, here's the layout, you'll notice that it's very square. It's on a grid pattern, and this is completely on purpose. The idea was the city should be completely rational. And normally, if you think of a village, you do not think of nice grid pattern streets and all, right? You think of winding alleys and fence lines and things like that that had contributed to a much more chaotic look. Here, the city is super intentional. It's laid out in accordance with sort of Chinese principles of what we would now call like feng shui or whatever, but in accordance with the sort of proper rites and directions. So the Imperial Palace is up at the top, right, at the edge of the city. The city is bifurcated, so it's exactly the same on one side as the other. There's an eastern market and a western market, right, so you don't have to cross depending on where you live. All these dots represent different temples. So there's a ton of Buddhist temples and Taoist temples, but not just that. This is the end hub of the Silk Road. So there's Christian temples, there's a Manichaean temple, there's all kinds of different stuff going on. There's a whole other version of Christianity, which you guys might not know about, named Nestorian Christianity, that originated quite early on. It's one of the earliest forms of Christianity, and it travels along the Silk Road. It was in China very early. Anyway, there's a Nestorian temple there in Chang'an, which was quite unusual when Europeans show up and they see some Christian stuff in one part of the city. It confuses them, right? For example. This is just an amazing place to be. It has the biggest population. It's a super thriving economy. It's all completely gated. So the residents there had some pretty sweet stuff going on. You've already seen about the postal service if you read the article about the Silk Road and the sort of postal office there. It continues to expand. There's post offices all over the country. At the height of the Tang, there's more than 1,600 post offices across the empire. It's really revolutionary. They're kind of everywhere. Here is one private residence within Chang'an. I went here and I took this picture. It's amazing. This is just the entryway to someone's house, right? It was a private residence. These huge sort of complex structures were built, and you get this new sort of aesthetic that's made possible by the sort of grandeur where you have these giant sliding doors and gardens and courtyards within the house, right? So it's really amazing. That's not to say, of course, that most people lived like this. This would have been of someone quite wealthy or an aristocrat. Lots of other stuff starts to happen in Chang'an. You get a whole sort of courtly life, and here you see a painting of sort of life of the elites, right, within one of these amazing houses. So they're out there with all their children, they're playing games. Within the sort of ideal Chinese house, you would have sort of a wall around it, but then inside the house you would have a big courtyard. So you would go in the front door, and instead of going into the house, you go into a courtyard. Then that's like a public space, but it's cut off from the rest of the public space. Then from there you can go into the house proper, right? So these sort of courtyard spaces were both private and public in a really interesting way. We'll see some more of that. So there's this really high quality of life for people that were elites within Chang'an for sure. Here's a depiction of the market streets in Chang'an. You can see they had these big wide streets that were fenced, right? You can park your camels and your horses all along them. And they would have shops that faced out right onto the street. So in a lot of ways, this looks very modern, right? I mean, this looks like a sort of current commercial market street that you might know when you go through, I don't know, like Lawrenceville or something. There's definitely like that main street with like all the little shops on it and stuff. This is designed in sort of the same way. But you can also get a sense that there's those fronts, and then behind them is the courtyards and where people actually live and stuff, right? So really amazing sort of cities. Also during this time, wood block printing is mastered. You may have heard that printing was invented in Europe by Gutenberg. That's absolute nonsense. Printing was developed much earlier in China. And then you might say, well, movable type printing was invented in Europe. No, that's not true either. Movable type printing was invented in China. And then you might say, well, metal movable type printing was invented in Europe. No, that's not true either. That was invented in Korea. So that whole story is kind of nonsense. But we'll see later. The Mongols are going to bring this printing technology to Europe. Anywho, so during the Tang Dynasty, printing becomes widespread. At first, basically, you have what you want to write, you write it out onto paper, you invert that and put it onto a wood block, and you carve it, right, so that on the block it's carved backwards. You can dip the block in ink or brush it with ink and then press the paper on it and pull it off, right? And that inverted image is now right-verted, or however you want to say that, re-inverted to make your book. So you can make all kinds of fun things with printing. It's not just books. You can make things like calendars or playing cards. These are an early card game, right? So new types of leisure, new types of social activity. And here is a replica of one of the earliest printed books. So in 868 is the very first known printed book that we still have left. Surely it wasn't the first one. It's just the earliest one that we have left. Here it is. It's in Chinese, and it might be pretty clear to you. It's a Buddhist text, right? So the earliest printed book that we know about is a Buddhist sutra printed in China. But clearly this was not technology and development, right? Here it is already made. So there would have been earlier renditions. We just don't have them. Also, the Tang had something great that previous people did not have and that they weren't going to have for a while: toilet paper. So if you don't think that's a great invention, I don't know, man. I don't know what's going to throw you. Toilet paper is pretty good. If I could pick to live somewhere that had toilet paper versus didn't, I'm going to go with toilet paper. Also, just incredible urbanization, right? A third of the world population during the Tang Dynasty lived in China. That's just an incredible amount. Right, today people think of China as incredibly densely populated, maybe 1.1 billion out of a little less than like the 8 billion people on Earth, so maybe about an eighth, right? Here you're talking about a third of the population of the world lives in China. It's an incredible, deeply urbanized, pre-modern state comparatively. And lots of this tied into foreign trade with Southeast Asia, a growing trade with the Islamic world. Remember, by 700, 800, you're starting to get a growing sort of Islamic cultural sphere. Islam is very excited about and concerned with trade. Islam is both a religion and a sort of empire to begin with, right? And the sort of Islamic empires are very excited about trading, particularly through the Silk Road and through India, and so eventually with China. So Chang'an is just a hop-in place. It's the place to be. Additionally, there's all kinds of art and leisure that develops during this time. So the government begins to sponsor the arts, sort of widely defined. Why would a government do this? Well, it adds to their legitimacy. It adds to their cultural power. It shows how wealthy you are, right? So during the Sui and the Tang, you begin to get all kinds of new artistic forms, new painting. It also demonstrates a sort of leisure aspect. If you don't have some leisure time, you can't sit around and play cards, right? Or you can't get dressed up in all your frippery and play with your little doggy if you don't have any money or you don't have any time. So leisure time in and of itself implies a sort of more successful economy, right? These people aren't gearing up to fight the kingdom next door or something like that. They have more sort of relaxed times. You start to see things like this. These are Chinese people playing polo. Polo comes from Central Asia, right? So this would have been brought in by those Turkish peoples and became popular in China. Polo is great because it's a sort of, if you don't know, it's basically a horse-based game where there's an object you want to sort of move around to score. It's like you're playing soccer on a horse in a sense. It's sort of trained you for for war, but also is competitive without, you know, too much stakes. Although people do get hurt in it pretty frequently. Here's this emperor um, playing the flute. So you can sort of see this new sort of musical inclinations, aesthetic inclinations, right? It looks like a great time to be around. If you can play the flute, apparently these ladies will, you know, flock to you and stuff like that. That's nice. Here are some dancing women, right, depicted in statues. There's all kinds of new music, dancing, painting. So we've seen some painting styles so far, but nothing quite like this. This is really incredible. It's not monocolor, right? There's multiple colors in it, but the way color is used is really interesting. It's not realistic, but it's developing this sort of Chinese style of sort of mountains and clouds that's attached to Taoism and also attached in some ways to Buddhism. This sort of ethereal world, nature as a sort of alternative to these new crowded cities. So you might live in a really hustly, bustly city and stuff, but you might have a cool painting like this up on your wall to remind you about the sort of spiritual energies of the country or something. You might also have a background on your computer, right, that's totally different from your daily life or something like this. Today, right, it's the same sort of idea. Here's a painting depicting some aristocrats riding horses, right? You can see these really colorful clothing, really elaborate sort of horse gear. So there's this whole sort of sense of money and leisure. We wouldn't really call it like a middle class. It's too soon for that. But the empire was thriving with new fashion, new ways for you to enjoy yourself, right, and enjoy life. Here's a painting. This is a mural actually from one of those tombs that you might have read about last time, just a little later. It shows this lady in just like really cool clothes, right, a very artistic style, with the bird there to, you know, give you a sense that she's in nature. Cool sort of hairstyles, fancy clothes, right? So one way to try to get a sense of what these people were wearing is to look at these sorts of things. We don't have a ton of the clothing left, right? Because it tends to dissolve pretty quickly. But you can see things like this and get a sense of like these people were embracing all kinds of cool fashions. And these are not necessarily all from China. So because they're tied into Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea and Central Asia, even into, you know, South Asia and Europe in a sense, there's a huge inflow of all this sort of cosmopolitan stuff that's getting reworked by the Chinese to make sense to them, right? This is a painting made in China that's supposed to represent the European goddess of Venus, or Mercury. I can't remember. Yeah, I can't quite tell from there either. Anyway, so this is really interesting because again, you see this sort of blending of ideas, right? It's a new style of painting that's not really accurate. It's kind of mystical, but it's kind of funky. It's showing some of those different color techniques and sort of ethereal techniques to it. It's pretty cool. Here's this is from a manuscript that describes silk production. So you know, people are wearing all kinds of cool new silk clothes, and actually a lot of trade in silk, right? This was the big commodity for the Han, and it's been ever since in China, right along the Silk Road. But so now you can have books where you print, like telling people how to make silk and all these sorts of things. It's pretty amazing. Here again is a new painting style, this sort of silhouetted style. Just a few brush strokes. It's kind of reminiscent of Chinese characters, but it's also clearly a person, but it's like just not very many, right, brush strokes, and all of a sudden you have this outline. It's very cool. You can see people do this sometimes at like fairs or something, right, where they do like 10 strokes or something, and there's a picture you can recognize. It's this very minimalist style. Sometimes this is associated with Buddhism, right? And this sort of minimalism that comes from that with certain schools of Buddhism. There's also all new sorts of poetic forms and styles, which were very important to the Chinese. Some of the great sort of masters, if you study Chinese poetry today, a lot of the great masters come from this period in Tang where there's these new sort of forms that really speak to people still today. People really love them. Not surprisingly, a lot of them are about drinking wine and having a good time. They sort of hit on Taoist themes, Buddhist themes, themes of sort of the imperial grandeur, stuff like this. Let me play you a poem. Sometimes I read these, but I'll just have this person read it for you. You can check it out, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
A cup of wine under the flowering trees. I drink alone, for no friend is near. Raising my cup, I beckon the bright moon, for he, with my shadow, will make 3 men. The moon, alas, is no drinker of wine. Listless, my shadow creeps about my side. Yet, with the moon as friend, and the shadow as slave, I must make merry before the spring is spent. To the songs I sing, the moon flickers her beams. In the dance I weave, my shadow tangles and breaks. While we were sober, 3 shared the fun. Now we are drunk, each goes his way. May we long share our odd, inanimate feast, and meet at last on the cloudy river of the sky.
Yeah, good one. So a lot of these poems are like this. This is a scholar, right? A lot of these poets would have been Confucian scholars who maybe didn't make the cut, but they had to study poetry, so they're not going to be a Confucian scholar anymore. So now they just do poetry. So it's a man drinking by himself with the moon. His shadow is the third person. They're having a great time, right? It has a certain aesthetic to it. It's includes nature themes. It has a sort of spiritual theme to it in a sense, but it's not really heavy on that. So this is exactly the sort of poetry that is still super popular in China when you're talking about like traditional Chinese poetry. It has a lot going on for it. Yeah, so we'll see some more of those sorts of things coming up. So what happens with the Tang? How do they end? I mean, I'm not going to give you the full ending. We'll kind of save that, but everything is not perfect. Over, hundreds of years, of course, you're going to have problems within the state. One of the first big problems that hints that the Tang might not last forever is a rebellion by An Lushan. During his rebellion, millions of people die. So the Tang Dynasty does still have some of those problems of imperial overreach, the same as the Sui. Whenever you have a really big, complex society, some people aren't going to be happy about it. The book does a pretty good job talking about Lushan's rebellion. I'll kind of leave that rather than talk too much specifically about it. But it does sort of set the stage that everything's not sort of perfect in Dream World, even though the economy is great and the state has never been bigger or better. There's still conflict within the state, right? So states normally end, either there's conflict from inside or outside, or both, right? In the case of the Tang, you start to get sort of more problems within the state. In 907, the Tang Dynasty is going to end. We'll talk more about that sort of next time. But by the end of the Tang Dynasty, China is much more of a thing. So previously I've been hesitant when we do the assignments and we talk about it to talk about China, because really it's sort of like if you did a European history class but you never talked about Germany or France or Spain or Italy or anything like that, you were just like, Europe is like this, Europe is like this, people would lose their minds. They'd be like, no, there's all these different places that are all different. I mean, yeah, they're kind of similar, but they're all totally different. It's the same in China, but from a Western perspective, we've just decided that it doesn't matter. It's basically all just one thing. By the end of the Tang, you can start to make a much better pitch that it really is one thing. You're coming out of this sort of period after the Han Dynasty where there's a lot of sort of cosmopolitanism. There's all kinds of different groups of people. By the end of the Tang, people are much more self-consciously aware of sort of being Chinese. It's more homogenous. That's not to say it's all one thing. There continues to be, right up until today, tons of different languages and ethnicities and races within China and all these sorts of things. But there is a sort of basic cultural thread that runs through this area that we now call China. And the biggest is probably the Confucian education system. By the time that the Tang Dynasty is ended, the idea of a meritocracy and Confucian exams and Confucian learning and a scholarly bureaucratic class are just completely steeped into Chinese culture. Imagining China without them is almost impossible. At the same time, under the Tang, basically what it meant to be Han changed. Han previously had been sort of, at least, an ethnic group. Under the Tang, anybody within the empire was Han. It's how you referred to subjects of the empire. So it doesn't particularly matter ethnicity within Han, language, all that sort of stuff wasn't variable. Han was just the people of the Tang Dynasty. And even once the Tang Dynasty falls apart, all of those people are still Han, they're still Chinese in some sense. Also, by the ending of the Tang Dynasty, more and more people are suspicious of foreigners, which sort of tells us a bit about their own identity. You can't be like suspicious of other people if you think you're the same, right? So by the end of the Tang, like people that were outside the Tang Dynasty appear to the Han as much more different somehow. Whereas previous iterations of China, there were these people on the outside, like the Hu and stuff. But as long as they learned Chinese, they were Chinese, or they mixed and mingled in all kinds of ways. By the end of the Tang, there's this more clear sort of state separation, where there's sort of foreign states that are looked on as different. The Koreans, the Japanese, Southeast Asians, right? Turkish people, stuff like this. And there's a sort of suspicion of these people because there's this growing idea that, China's always had dynasties and they've always been a thing, and they always get upset and attacked by people from the outside. That's not quite true, but it was a sort of popular idea. Along with this, the sort of transmission of the way, which is a fun sort of just meaning of like the spread of Buddhism, had become really complete across China. And there was a big sort of bonding there between Chinese folks over a shared sort of set of Buddhist values as well. So there's lots and lots of things that come to tie Chinese people together into more of a sort of homogenous unit or almost ethnicity, despite having all kinds of differences. So even though what made the Sui and Tang kind of so great in some ways was this really cosmopolitan world that emerged out of the Silk Road and all of these dynasties coming together and stuff, by the end of the Tang, that's sort of transformed into a more clear definition of what we might mean by Chinese, if that makes sense. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the discussions too. Yeah, there you go. There's a very classic depiction of sort of what we might think of as like Chinese or something, right? Yeah. So when you see like cartoonish depictions of China now or something, all you have to do is show a picture like this, and everyone's like, "Aha! I'm in China," right? So these sorts of styles, these artistic designs, come to be more sort of characteristic, inclusive, denoting like Chineseness, right? Is more of a thing. Here you go, Chinese women making silk, right? Like if you look at this picture, probably without taking this class, you're like, ah, something Chinese, right? So these sorts of ideas get really ingrained sort of within people, right? There's a Confucian scholar. Okay, so let's talk about how this plays out in Japan a bit. In Japan, you see something similar. Just like with the Sui and Tang, you get this sort of increase in imperial power and a more unified state. That same process is going to happen in Japan, at first anyway, motivated by what's happening in China to an extent. Then pretty quickly it's going to take off on its own trajectory. So we'll look a little bit first in the sort of development of these more sort of specifically imperial Japanese state, how they were influenced by China, and then how they're going to sort of go their own way pretty quickly. So the last time we were talking about Japan, we were talking about the Yamato period and the sort of formation of the imperial line and the rise of certain families like the Soga clan, the introduction of all of these new ideas from Korea and China. And I told you that the Soga clan became very powerful. Well, as the political situation evolves, the Soga clan marry into the imperial family, which has no family name, right? They're just the imperial family, they don't need it. So they become more and more powerful. And we actually saw almost like a little coup almost, where the Soga clan put themselves in a position where their daughters were marrying into the clan or into the imperial line and stuff like that. Well, not everybody agrees with that. Remember, there were different households that were in conflict, vying for attention and power, for money, and some of them were associated with the imperial line in different ways. If you were in the imperial family, like really broadly defined, you would be nowhere near the throne. You might be 40 people away from the throne. So to see the Soga clan continue to have a really big influence was disheartening, and some people saw them as too powerful and wanted to get rid of them. That's going to happen. In 645, there's what's called the Taiko coup. So the coup is planned by a guy named Nakatomi Kamatari. Kamatari is really clever, and he thinks that basically in order for anyone else to get ahead, these Soga people gotta go. He approaches a prince who's pretty far from the imperial line in terms of ever becoming the emperor, Prince Nakano Oe. So Oe is gonna be the one who's gonna actually make things come to pass. When there's a court ceremony that all the important Soga family clan is at, Prince Nakano Oe and some of his warriors, retainers, they're not quite samurai yet, set them up to get trapped. Here he is, by the way, Nakano Oe. And at this court ceremony, they whip out the swords, and the Soga clan leaders get their heads, tossed off, as you can see here, in some pretty violent struggles. Now, this is, of course, a much later depiction, so the swords are kind of the wrong swords and stuff like that. Anyway, the Soga family leadership gets assassinated, and all of a sudden, they're not so powerful anymore. Instead, Prince Nakano Oe is going to make himself the new emperor, Tenji. It's not a change of the imperial line because theoretically he's a member of the imperial family. He just wasn't going to be the next emperor. So he's going to reign for a short period, 662 to 671, you can see there. But it's not just Emperor Tenji. Nakatomi Kamatari is also going to get a lot out of this. Remember, he planned the sort of end of the Soga clan because he saw them as having too much power. When that happens, he's going to take a new name, Fujiwara, for his family, for his clan. So he's going to be Fujiwara no Kamatari, right? So he's going to change his clan name. So in Japanese, by the way, if you don't know this, the first name you see is actually the last name, right? So instead of Nakatomi, that's being replaced by Fujiwara, right? Anyway, so the Fujiwara family is now going to become what the Soga clan used to be. Over the next 100 years or so, the Fujiwara are going to become the most powerful clan. They helped put Emperor Tenji in power. It was kind of their plan. Then their house is going to rise in prominence and power, even as the imperial line goes merrily along. So here he is now as Emperor Tenji, right? No longer Prince Nakano-Oe. This is Kamatari, and you see he's got a certain look. We're going to see that again in just a second, right? So there he is again as Fujiwara. So the Taika reforms are interesting. This is what happens after the coup. So there's the coup, the Soga clan is out. You have this new sort of imperial, the line is the same, but you have new leadership in the imperial family. And you have this new, really powerful family. So what do? Well, they want authority. They want legitimacy. They came into power by somewhat dubious means. So they're afraid of not being seen as legitimate or not being strong enough to fend off China and Korea, these other growing powers that they're aware of to their west, right? So the idea of the Taika reforms was to emulate what the Chinese were doing that was making them unified and strong. So this is happening at the same time as the Sui and the Tang, their sort of prominence, their new incredible sort of imperial reach and economic success. And the leaders in Japan want the same thing. So they start to enact Chinese policies that they think will help them develop Japan into a more contemporary, strong, unified imperial state. One of the first things they do in 670 is the household registration. So basically, it's a census. And they want to know how many people are in, they're going to call it an empire, but their kingdom or in Japan or whatever you want to say. How many people, where they live, what does the land look like, how many villages, how many households, all these sorts of things. How much grain is being produced in these villages, a basic census. And they want this information because as a new sort of, they're not a new government, it's the same government, but as new leaders of the same government, they want to know, okay, how should we tax people? Well, if you don't know how many people you have or how productive they are, you don't know how to tax them. They want a strong military. Well, how do we conscript an army if we don't know how many people are in the countryside? They want to redistribute land. They want to allocate land. And as part of this process, they set up a system that's surprisingly ahead of its time, where essentially every 6 years, they're going to take a new census of the whole of Japan. So this is pretty important kind of powerful stuff. In one way, it's the government knowing a lot more about the people they're actually governing. In another way, it's the government gaining a tremendous amount of power over those people. Not to be too trite or whatever, but knowledge is power. If the government knows where people are, it can tax them easier, all that sort of stuff. As part of this program of reforms, the government also issues new coins. For quite a long time, the people in Japan had been using basically Chinese coins. Now they're going to be making their own. So you have more of a sort of state-monitored economy more state participation in the success of the economy. Also, during this period, the state writes its histories. So you get official histories produced by the elites in Japan, namely the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. These are both the sort of foundational mythical documents. They're, if you're on the far right in Japan today, you might see these as real historical documents. For most Japanese, they're kind of a mix, right? So it begins with this brother-sister duo that has a magical sphere that spear that they swirl in the water, and when they pull the spear up, drops fall off, creating the islands of Japan. So stuff like that. But it also includes a history of this new sort of Fujiwara clan and the Imperial line, and it's very heavy on the greatness of the people who are in power who are having these histories made. So you can get a sense that the emperor is going to figure very prominently and importantly in these histories, and indeed that's true. In fact, according to these histories, the sun goddess Amaterasu, which is she's depicted here, basically begins the imperial clan. So the case is made that the emperor is descended from the sun god, right? So this is tying together Shintoism, the sort of newly emerging sort of animistic religions, into a more unified religious body of work, tying it to the emperor. The sort of height of Shintoism in Japan is Ise Shrine, right, which is tied to the imperial family. So there's this sort of connection between the Shinto religion as a thing, as a sort of unified body of knowledge, and the imperial family, and these new sort of histories that are being written about Japan, right? And they're all kind of coalescing to give the imperial family more power. As part of this, you also get the Taiho codes, which do things like lay out all the different provinces in Japan, lay out all the different taxation schemes. So a real sort of much more, not quite, I wouldn't say law-based, but sort of document-based government that has a sort of centralized state planning. So much more unified and centralized than we've seen before in Japan on this big scale. This leads us to what we would call the Nara period. So a lot of these Japanese periods, they're basically just named after where the capital is. So after the coup, you get a new capital built in Nara. And this is another area where they're going to imitate the success of the Chinese. So over about 4 years, 708 to 712, this new capital is built at Nara, and the city is designed to emulate Chang'an. So remember, we already looked at that. It's both on the grid pattern, it's sort of the same left to right, all these sorts of things. So here the Chinese are just borrowing straight from, or the Japanese are borrowing straight from China. What makes for an imperial capital, they want that sort of model to be successful. At the same time, just like in China, the state is going to sponsor Buddhism. So for all of the same reasons that they're doing it in the Sui and Tang Dynasty, the Japanese imperial family and aristocrats and elites are going to donate to Buddhist institutions, build Buddhist temples, have the sutras read, all these sorts of things. Here's a depiction of Nara. So it's still there in some ways, but here's how it might have looked at the time. You can get a sense of that big sort of grid pattern, right, that the city's built on. This is one of the watchtowers or sort of guard posts. They're often called gates, right, on the city walls. So if you hear like, oh, the gate on the wall, it's not like a swinging gate. It's a whole sort of building complex that's kind of simultaneously a watchtower and the entryway and stuff like that. So this is a recreation, right, of one of the gates that stood at the time. So this is a huge um, sort of, it's not a military, a sort of huge defensive wall and structure around the city, right? That it encloses the space, not just for protection, but for sort of legitimacy and right this like veneer of importance and authority that you see. So yes, you start to see things like this. So this is Todaiji. This is a huge Buddhist temple that gets built in Nara. It's sponsored by the state and by important members of the aristocracy to show their support for Buddhism. Remember, the Soga clan came to power in some ways because of their attachment to Buddhism, so it seems natural that their sort of inheritors would do the same thing. Inside of Todaiji is the Daibutsu, which is the giant Buddha or great Buddha, or literally just big Buddha. So here you go. Here's the Daibutsu statue. Really large. You can't see from this angle, but this is a good angle to see the sort of structure of the building and that cool Japanese joining work on those pillars. So those, you can see like those, the wood coming together up there is really funky. It's a cool statue. Here it is from the side, so you can see the scale, right? There's some people down there at the bottom for scale. So this is a huge statue, taking lots of work, artisans, right, trying to do this. Why do you do these? Why do you spend so much money on this? It gives authority to the state, right? If the state sponsors these sorts of things and people are religious, it sort of shows the goodness of the state, right? So there's this growing connection between Buddhism and the state. But everything is not exactly the same as in China. They do bring Confucianism. So Confucius is important to Japanese thinking. Japanese intellectuals are reading him, philosophers are reading him and stuff. But even though the sort of Confucian values and the idea of the proper rights and the relationships are deeply ingrained in Japanese society from here on, the idea of a meritocracy is not. So there's not really Confucian exams, there's not a Confucian bureaucracy. It's more like a sort of guiding moral and ethical principles is how the Japanese develop it. So to be a good aristocrat, you still have to read the Chinese thinkers on Confucius. You should still embrace his beliefs, but there's not a meritocracy for who gets to be emperor or something like that. The clans vie for power, and if you have a stronger military or more money, then you get the position. It's not about sort of Confucian meritocracy. So again, they're borrowing from China here, but not wholesale. At the same time that all of this stuff is going awesome, in Japan, something pretty bad happens. Around 735, a smallpox epidemic breaks out in Japan. And it goes on for a couple of years because diseases are like this, right? They're often cyclical, as you know, right? Sometimes there's highs and then it kind of dies back down for a bit and then it spikes again. So either from Korea or China, we're not quite sure. Smallpox enters Japan. You get a bit of island biology here in that Japanese people had not been exposed to smallpox before that we know of, and it was completely devastating. There was no sort of built-up immunity in the population. Here you have a depiction of a sort of god of disease, right? This sort of incubus weird thing who is sort of smallpox incarnate. Anyway, it ravages the countryside. Maybe about a quarter of the population dies. This is in 3 or 4 years. So this is an incredible sort of disease outbreak, and people turn to Buddhism in response. People turn to sort of traditional levels of authority, but we're so far from sort of modern medicine or understanding about why it's happening, of course, that just doesn't work. So even in the midst of like huge success, there's still problems. Uh, Another really interesting story that comes out of the Nara period is the Empress Kōken. I'll put up a link in the. A friend of mine made a cool video just sort of all about Kōken, so I'll put up a link about her in the announcements. But basically, one of the emperors doesn't have a son, so he has his daughter become the next emperor. And not like a regent or anything like that, he just declares that she's going to be the emperor. So that goes well for a minute. But remember that Fujiwara family that helped put this imperial line into play? They're upset. And the leader of the Fujiwara clan basically engages in a coup to get her thrown out. When she's thrown out, she becomes ill and sees a Buddhist magician or healer, if you will, who cures her. And they either become best friends or fall in love. It's kind of complex. Anyway, she rides back into the capital and basically, through a convoluted process, declares herself emperor again. That's why you'll see she has two different reign years. It's like 749 to 758. Then there's a break. Then she's going to come back into power. When she comes back into power, she brings that Buddhist monk with her, and she gives him a cush job at the top. And then there's maybe another attempted coup. He might try to be coming into power. It's really complex. There'll be a whole video about it. It's kind of fun. Anyway, she's closely associated with Buddhism, and it doesn't work out. In the end, people are going to disavow her, and they're going to have been very threatened by the role of Buddhism in the state. So after Empress Kōken, the court is going to get more and more sort of into Shinto tradition. In fact, they're going to move the whole capital away from Nara because Nara has been so closely associated with Buddhism. And this is the last kind of woman emperor on her own. There's a couple more we'll come across, but this also really puts people off the idea of a woman as the emperor. So anyway, watch that video. It's a good one. She does a great job with some animation and stuff, so I'll put that up for you. Here she is. So in the middle there is the Buddhist, right, who's causing all this trouble. You'll see him in that other video. So when the capital moves, you get what's called the Heian period. And again, it's because a new capital is built at Heian, modern-day Kyoto. So this is going to be the capital until 1869. So this is kind of the early Heian period we're going to look at today. If you've been to Japan, this is like the tourist site where most people go. Most people fly into Tokyo or Kyoto, and then Kyoto is where there's all the sort of like cultural stuff. It starts during this period. When the capital moves, remember the same imperial family is in place. The Fujiwara clan is still very powerful, but they're beginning to take a whole different trajectory than what's going on in China. The Tang Dynasty is firmly in place, but they've had some problems with Empress Wu and other stuff over there. And it's during this period that Japan is going to start to divide more and more from China. So they've gained an awful lot from Chinese philosophy and art and language and aesthetics, Confucian values, Buddhism, but there's becoming enough sort of centralized political force within Japan to just sort of be its own state and need or desire a lot less sort of input from outside. So they're going to start to diverge from other developments in China. As part of this, it's because you get a more centralized politic. So more and more of the Japanese islands are sort of coming under rule of the state. The state is becoming more and more defined from those Taiho codes and other things. And you really start to see a sort of complex political situation develop where it's basically these powerful families and the emperor as two sort of sources of power running in tandem that are sort of in conflict for who's the real sort of leadership, right, of Japan. Of these families, the most powerful is that Fujiwara family. They're involved in that coup against the empress and other stuff too, so check that out. So as part of that, by 770, the idea of a female emperor is out. No more female emperors. Also, as part of that situation, the conscript armies were involved. So what the big families kind of figure out is the conscript armies are in a sense dangerous and they're expensive for the state. So if the main sort of state has a big conscript army, that's very expensive. Instead, what the imperial family does and what the sort of governmental body does is they farm out. Each sort of big family has their own sort of combination of local warriors, their own military forces. They do things like what we would now consider police work or work of the National Guard or Coast Guard. That's all done by local warriors, if you will. These are the people that are going to become the samurai down the road. We're just not quite there yet. Also during this period, you have a much more direct economy. So during the Heian period, because they're sort of differing from China and because the capital has been moved, the central authority is not really as concerned with economics in the sense of sort of guiding the whole process. So they stop minting new coins, they stop having monopolies in certain areas. It's much more up to the people. So here's the new capital, by the way, at Kyoto, a sort of layout of it. So it's still in that Chang'an model. It's still on a grid pattern, right? Yeah, so here's the Fujiwara family. You can always tell it's the Fujiwara by that sort of pattern on their kimono. So they have a particular sort of pattern, right? A particular crest. There's the emperor. So there's your powerful families and your emperors. Okay, so here's a depiction of peasants paying their taxes. So it's kind of hard to, when you're like, well, what is a direct economy? What does that mean? So the peasants grow rice, and then a certain amount of rice they have to give to the elite families, or the emperor, basically. So they're not necessarily dealing in coins, you're dealing in rice as a form of payment. So you're taxed in rice. In some ways that's easier. It means you don't have to get coins. You don't have to sell your rice. You grow rice, you give a certain percentage of it to the government, that's it. On the other hand, there's a reason we use money and we don't trade in, I don't know what we would even trade in, maybe rice, I guess flour or something, right? You know, there's a reason we don't do that. Coins obviously move along an economy. It's a more it's easier to regulate, but also it's much more efficient. You don't need it, obviously, to make it work. Japan had a huge economy, even with this direct economy. So during the early Heian, you get back to the sort of direct economy. It is sort of signifies the sort of decentralization in some ways. On the other hand, it's very strict what gets done. About half of everything that's grown goes to the emperor or these elite families, and about half is going to stay with the people who actually do the farming. So it's not like loosey-goosey or anything like that. That's a big taxation. It's just not done through a direct sort of model of economic activity. Here is a painting of sort of the capital, and you can get a sense that it's not like the economy is you know, useless or anything like that. Things look pretty nice, right? In fact, here I think you have warriors training. This is like those local warriors I told you about. But you can get a sense that there's still an awful lot going on. So during this early Heian period, where people start to urbanize into these big cities, and these elite come to sort of differentiate themselves from regular folks more and more. And when Japan is sort of starting to differentiate itself from China and Korea a little bit more, is when you start to get this elite culture that is really recognizable as unique and authentically Japanese. Now, normally, whenever you hear someone use the word authentic, you should be careful. And I don't mean it like in the real sense or something. I just mean something that is different than you would find in China or Korea, and is specific sort of to the period. It also comes to be sort of stereotypical when people think of Japan. This is often what they're thinking about, this sort of culture and the sort of elite culture. So it's actually a relatively small subsection of society and people in Japan. There were already tons and tons of people in Japan, and we'll talk about the majority in just a second. But in terms of the elite, we're talking about 20,000 people or so. And of them, about 150 of them are the like high aristocrats that, we know their names, and we have material about them and stuff. So we're talking about a relatively small section of society. They're also based in the capital. So this new capital, Kyoto, these people are absentee landlords. They have huge estates out in the country, thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres, right? That provide them to have these giant sort of complexes within the city. So they live in the city where they experience like elite life and culture, and then way out, hundreds of miles away is their giant land holding that produces the wealth that they live off of. So what does this elite culture look like? It is filled with art and literature. Some of it you might know, like the Tale of Genji is the most famous from this period, and this is a painting depicting a scene from the Tale of Genji. Basically, these sorts of works were quite common in a sense. Well, they're not common, there's not that many, but it's a common style of, they're sort of romantic, they're about courtly life, they're about the things that go on behind the scenes, they're about the interactions with people. A lot of these high elites, it's not like they have a job. They are wealthy because they were born wealthy, and they have a sort of cultural expectation that they don't actually work per se. There's a sort of style to it all. I gave you some of the reading, so one of the reading options is not the Tale of Genji, but it's also written during this period. It's the so-called Pillow Book, which makes it sound strangely erotic, but it's not. It's, there is some of that in there, but mostly what it is because at the time, pillows were made of this sort of, basically like a wooden block that you kind of put your head on, that was, had like a fabric over it or something. But a lot of those blocks had like drawers in them that you could slide open, and where you could keep a diary. So the Pillow Book is ostensibly a diary that goes in one of those, if you read that section. Anyway, so you start to get these sorts of things that we see as Japanese, a unique sort of aesthetic that has its own set of characteristics. And when we read about these, I have some of this in the reading a little bit later, like what it is that makes a distinct sort of Japanese style. There's sort of plays between nature and objects made by people. There's a sort of sensitivity to your surroundings. There's a sort of minimalism that's captured in Japanese. There's an asymmetry. There's this idea of impermanence, right, coming with Buddhist ideas. Lots of these sorts of things that you might be able to sort of point to, um, that are sort of within these huge sort of compounds for the elite. So here is a sort of one of these compounds. You can see these like massive number of houses and stuff like this, right? A lot of these, like the Tale of Genji and the Pillow Book, you need to sort of see this image of how these houses are laid out to get it when they talk about the book, because there's lots of these aristocrats like moving around and they're in these houses, but they're not seeing each other or other people. There's lots of servants, there's lots of little back ways to go, so you can kind of sneak into someone else's room, you can overhear their conversations. It's sort of the format of how things are laid out spatially, so that's going to help you understand a little bit some of that material. This is a replica, a painting, showing what it was like inside one of these fancy homes. Inside of the courtyard of this fancy home, there was a big space where there would be performances and dances, all of this sort of artistic style. We actually know an awful lot about what these people did on a daily basis because they write about it. They write poetry, they play this sort of interesting kickball game, which I'll show you a video of in a second, and they drink a ton of wine. So you sit around and you eat really good food and you write poetry and you drink a ton of wine and you play kickball. It's pretty sweet. If you're a lady, you get all kinds of cool fashionable clothes. Heavy, right? So these are like different layers of kimono. So you can't just walk around in like one layer. You have like several layers of these like fine silk sort of robes. This comes with a whole sort of aesthetic about what women are supposed to do, what they're supposed to wear. As if you read in the Pillow Book, there's all sort of like prescriptions about what women can and can't do, sort of, but then they don't actually seem to do those things. There's also an awful lot of sexuality in this time that's pretty unique. The way that love and sex are described in the Tale of Genji and the Pillow Book and other writings from this time is quite different from in China. And so one of the other readings that you have is about Chinese erotica, sort of, or sort of the erotic impulse in Chinese thinking during the Tang. It's a great reading. Anyway, in Japan, something really different is occurring. The relationship between men and women is supposed to have these sorts of taboos to them, but in reality, people were having all kinds of sex and not really observing those taboos in quite the same way. There was no sort of moral prohibition towards having sex or having sex before you were married or anything like that. It's evolving pretty differently, and you'll get a sense of that when you do the reading. It's something uniquely Japanese. Here's some depictions of that kind of correlate. There's often like scenes where people are getting romantically involved, let's say, but there's like servants around or there are other guests around and things like that, and it's not considered weird or immoral or anything like that. Remember, these are elites with lots of free time, so you see a bunch of stuff like that, and you can read a little bit about it. Yeah, this is pretty cool artwork here. This is a very uniquely sort of Japanese style, right, where you have bits of fabric that are overlaid to make the artwork instead of painting or something like that. Yeah, really cool. Yes. One thing that people probably know a little about if they're hip to Japan is like food. So this is an example of what you might eat if you went to dinner at one of these houses amongst this elite class at the time. You'll notice there's no sushi yet. That's not a thing yet. But all kinds of really fancy, elaborate food, all kinds of seafood, forest products, seaweed, noodles, tofu, all kinds of really elaborate dishes, right? As it might not surprise you, this is not what the average person ate. This is for the elites. So there's a whole sort of set orders for the food. You eat this before this, this before this. There's different booze that goes with the different food. There's different food for different occasions, celebrations. They don't do like appetizer, entree, dessert. Like that's not an Asian thing at all. You would just have sort of all of the different stuff and eat it as you liked. But there is some ritual around it. There's lots of taboos about how you eat, when you eat things. You shouldn't leave your chopsticks, in certain ways. All that sort of stuff develops in a characteristically Japanese way. Here's that kickball game. I'll play that for you for a second, and you can get a sense of what that looks like. This, of course, is going to be a little bit different. This is like a historical reenactment. People still play these games. The idea is to see how long you can keep it in the air. So it's kind of like a big hacky sack, only everybody's wearing kimonos. So let's check it out. You can see what you get how you like it. What do you think?
Wait.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's easy to kind of forget about these things, right? And like not take into account what it is. But like, this is very sort of elite, highbrow stuff, but it comes up regularly in the Tale of Genji or the Pillow Book or other books from this time about like, they were playing this game in the courtyard, whatever, and they met, or they saw this person playing the game and were attracted to them or something like that. So it does come up. And also, again, it speaks to the sort of leisure of this particular kind of class, right? And it's just something that wouldn't have been accessible to the average person. Well, what do we know about the average person at this time? Regular folk, at this time, maybe there's about 6 million of them in the Heian period. And we start to have enough information we can piece together what daily life would have been like for the regular folk a little bit. So first of all, maybe 5 or 10% of them would have been slaves. This means they don't have a family name. This means that they're tied to the land, kind of like serfs in Europe. It's not chattel slavery. It's not transatlantic slavery. It's not necessarily hereditary. This could be because you have no land. It could be because you owed taxes. It could be because you were sold into slavery. So there's lots of different ways this works. But basically, under this slave system, you're basically a peasant growing rice. And remember, there's forms of human bondage everywhere in the world. This is not unique to Japan or anything like that. But it isn't transatlantic slavery, which is a whole different sort of model. So most people in Japan, until the modern period, were farmers. And wet rice agriculture had really taken over. So most people grew rice. Although there were other things, specialty products, of course, the bulk of everything was rice. Your produce was divided, I've already sort of told you, about 50% goes to the elites and about 50% goes to the farmers themselves. So you're responsible for growing your rice in your village You get up every morning, you go out to the field, you basically work all day. Work is seasonal, right? So we're so used to modern work environments that often we don't think about. You work from sun up to sundown, you work during certain seasons, right? So in the winter, for example, you can't be growing the rice, but you can repair the fence, you can thatch the roof, you can do other work. So there's sort of a flow to it that we don't have. Um, Often these people dealt with hunger. They did not get a lot to eat. In particular, in the springs, this thing called the spring hunger, which is something that farmers had to deal with up until the modern period all over the world. Basically, you harvest your crop, you're taxed about 50%. A certain percentage of that goes to the imperial family, and the rest goes to whoever's land you're working, that family. Then the rest of the food you have to use to barter, right? Because you're in a rice exchange economy, and to eat. But you eat that food in the fall and the winter and then into the spring. But in the spring, you're starting to have to make some hard choices because your rice will be running low. If you eat all of your rice, what do you have to plant at the end of the spring or in the middle of the spring? Nothing, right? Because you ate it all. So unfortunately, a lot of farmers would be very hungry, even though they had rice in the cellar or in their big, pot. You wouldn't be able to eat it because if you ate it, you wouldn't have any rice to plant. So there's this sort of weird period in the spring where lots of people were sort of hungry or waiting for the harvest. And it gets a term actually in Japanese called the spring hungers. Anyway, we know some things about the marriage practices of regular folks. They were duo loco, which sounds like some kind of, alcoholic energy drink or something. But really it's a fancy anthropological term that means that when you got married, you and your wife continued to live separately. So for some people, this probably sounds like a dream. For other people, I don't know, maybe a nightmare. But marriage was about, and continues to be right up until the 20th century in most places around the world, about property, inheritance, and, kids. It has nothing to do with love necessarily. You get married to join families together and to decide lineage. So you got married to someone, maybe in your village, maybe in the village next door, but then you and your partner lived separately. You would only really visit each other for certain rites, during certain seasons, other weddings, funerals, stuff like that. But most of the time, you would continue to live with your family or your clan or your cousins, or, if you had your own house, you would live by yourself. And then see each other on certain occasions. As you might think, that led to all kinds of other funky issues, which I'll talk about in just a second. Also, surprisingly, inheritance was partable, which in the sort of pre-modern world is a little funky, meaning if I had two children, when I die, my inheritance would be split if my wife was still alive between my wife and the two children. So it wasn't primogeniture. It wasn't just like a new head of the family and the firstborn or the firstborn male or anything like that. Inheritance was split up amongst the family members. So in some ways this is really good in that it encourages a sort of broader safety net for these people. On the other hand, it also means that over time, lands and fortunes will get split up quite a bit more. Amongst the elites, they didn't really do this. All of the money and the property stays in the same family and the same line. But amongst the everyday, regular people, inheritance was much more split. Strangely also, in some ways, in other ways perfectly understandable, women had a lot more rights than you might expect within the society. For example, women could inherit money, so they were part of that split. They weren't, shut out. People had to pay a bride wealth to get married, which is kind of interesting. In some ways, this is seen as sort of misogynistic practice, but in practice, it means that women in the relationship had a sort of chunk of cash or, commodity of some kind that they took with them into the marriage, and then they were usually in control of. Women could get divorces. It was quite common. Most of them were like no fault divorces. If men and women wanted to separate, they could. Women could initiate loans. They could take out loans. They could give loans to other people, right, legally, with documentation and everything. So this is sort of funky. In the US, women couldn't even open their own bank account without their husbands until the 1970s, right? So very progressive in some ways. Um, Also, as I told you, men and women are living separately. So you get married, but you don't move out of your brother's house, right? Or your parents' house or whatever. So if your partner lives in the next village over, you might only see them a couple dozen times a year or something, or maybe a dozen times a year, or maybe five or something. So what do you do for the rest of the year when you want to have sex with someone? As it turns out, they had a sort of cultural practice to take care of this. It was called night crawling, or more, that's the sort of a literal, it might also be like night visitation is how it often is translated. Um, Again, there was no prohibition on people's sort of sexual endeavors. There was no concerns about homosexuality or anything like that. That not until the modern period, pretty much anywhere on Earth. And so what would happen was, whenever you were feeling amorous, let's say, you would sneak out of your house, and if you were the man did the sneaking, and you would go see a lady who you liked. And the way this worked is, after a certain time, after it was dark, you would head over towards her joint and, basically knock on the window and say, are you alone tonight? Or are you feeling like having a visitor? And if she said no, then nothing. Then you turn around and go home. If she says yes, then you sneak in. You do what you went there to do. You stay the night maybe, and then you sneak out before everybody else gets up in the morning. But even though it's sort of seems sneaky or something, everybody was doing it, and there was no sort of moral problem whether you were married or not. So there was no control over women in this situation or anything like that. So if a woman was living at her parents' house, she was married to a man in the next village, she might have other dudes come see her all the time because, people are people. Now, this leads to all kinds of funny stories, and there's actually like a lot of funny stories in Japanese literature about what happens during these nightly visitations, or comic mishaps. Someone goes to the wrong room, etc. But it was a part of rural life, and kind of surprises a lot of people, I think, when they find out about these sorts of things. Here's a sort of setup of what the average village might have looked like. So you see a lot of these houses, again, sort of within a prescribed city wall. There's some that would have been for ritual use, for food production, for communal meetings. And then there's some that would have been for religious gatherings. There's some that would have been for the authorities when they came to the village. But for the most part, very simple huts, and pretty much everybody would have had the same house, except for the rare elite that was stationed there, although there wouldn't have been very many in the village. There would have been a village sort of big man or whatever, if you will, but their differentiation from the regular villagers was not too much. Here's a nice example of what you ate as a villager. So on any given day, you might get up and have a nice soup with some green vegetables in it. You might have some salted vegetables. If you've had Japanese food, you're probably familiar with these. now, mostly like if you have sushi, right, you have like pickled vegetables there, but like with the ginger, right, is pickled, or a lot of sushi rolls have like the pickled daikon radish in it. You have some boiled brown rice that's partially dehulled, and you got some salt to mix into your rice and soup and stuff. Pretty basic food, right? It's so basic because if you're a peasant, you really don't have a lot of food. You're not getting big cuts of pork and, all that stuff's being sent to the imperial families. If you do manage to catch fish or something, that's a big deal. If you're getting access to those sorts of things, but most of the time you're farming all day, so you don't have access to that sort of stuff unless you live as part of a fishing village or something. So the average peasant diet was very basic, not very fulfilling, not something you'd want to really live on 365, right? And speaking of which, they didn't live very long. The average life expectancy for these peasants was about 25 years. So the average Japanese person did not have a lot of time. Partially, this is due to the fact that there was frequent bouts of disease and starvation. Also, life was just really hard. You're working a lot. No modern medicine and stuff like that yet. So lots of people didn't really make it even into their mid-20s, right? So pretty hard life for these Japanese peasants. And that's going to continue for quite a while, certainly through the Heian. All right, so that's enough there for now. Next time, we'll kind of look at more of the late Heian and what's going to evolve out of these imperial trajectories in Japan. We'll also look at what happens after the fall of the Tang and the sort of Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty's evolution. Get on those readings. Let me know what you think. I'm looking forward to the discussions. So keep trekking. What is this, week 5? Yeah, week 5. So we're doing great. I think you'll be more than a third of the way done by the time you get here. So awesome. See you next time.